Hi, I'm Matt from adventuresinaudio.co.uk, and this is my first video teaching the basics of sound engineering. Over the next few videos I will go through the fundamentals of mixing that you need to know before you go into any advanced mixing techniques. So today I'm going to talk about what's actually probably the most important part of mixing, and that's about gain and setting your gains correctly. So I'm going to go through what it is, why it's important, and how you should use it. These principles are useful both for live and studio work and should be used every time you mix to give you a great starting point before you go any further. So to explain gains are used to balance or calibrate or optimize levels from one piece of equipment to another. So for example, you've got a couple of microphones, one in front of an acoustic guitar which is quite quiet, and one that's in front of a snare drum which is extremely loud. So you use gain to balance the two out into your mixer or your audio workstation, so you have an even level playing field to work from. Gain's also used for matching inputs and outputs of different bits of equipment. So if you're working digitally in the studio, or analog for that matter, and you have analog outboard processors, so gates, compressors, EQs, you need to set the gain structure of everything up evenly so that everything's working at its optimum levels. And the same for live PA systems. You run from a mixing desk probably into a system controller, and then from a system controller to your amplifiers, and all those stages need to be set up correctly with gains. Even plugins in your DAW are calibrated to work optimally at certain gain levels, so if you can get the gain structure set correctly at the start, you make your life much easier later on. So it's well worth doing this every time you start a mix, just to get things in the right ballpark. So there's two things you're trying to achieve when setting gains. The first thing is to make sure that you have enough level coming in so that you've got something to work with. If it's far too low, it then becomes quite difficult to even things out in the mix later on. But secondly, you want to make sure that you give yourself enough headroom so that you're not clipping the signal. Clipping an input causes it to distort, and 99% of the time you really don't want to be doing that. There's a couple of arguments with analog gear where distorting it may give you a pleasing tonal quality to the sound, and so you may want to consider that, but until you know why you're doing that and the reasons for doing it and when not to do it, don't worry about getting involved with it. Just stick to these basic rules and you'll be in a very, very good starting point. So I have a track recorded with drastically different levels here, just to give an obvious demonstration of how this works. So let's have a listen through to the track and see what's wrong with it. Okay, so we can hear from this at the moment that the Hammond organ sound is really loud. That's on 2 channels, so you're getting double the volume, plus you can see from the metering it's up a lot higher than everything else, so the Hammond is probably too loud. The bass and the guitar are there, a bit weak maybe, but it's all relative, so we'll see what happens as we balance this out together. I've sorted out roughly the toms and the cymbals earlier just to speed up the video, but the kick and snare are non-existent. They're so quiet that you can't really hear what's going on. So what we're going to do is, using this trimmer tool as our gain control and using the peak level meter here, we're going to start by trying to make everything hit at -18, which is the first yellow light on this meter. We're just going to go through, balance each individual channel out to that, and see what happens after that. So we'll start with the kick. Okay, the kick's looking good. We'll go on to the snare. Snare's now good. Let's move on to the bass. Looks like we could probably just touch the bass up a little bit. That's looking pretty good. Let's try the guitar. Guitar's looking great. And now we can see from the organ that it's peaking up high, so we're going to drop that back. A little bit over still, but that's not a bad point. Okay, so just by balancing out all these gains evenly, we've already brought the mix into a much more manageable starting point. So if we start where we were, and then I'll drop the gains in to just show you the difference. Okay, so as we can hear from that, it's already a lot more manageable, and you could quite happily start your mixing from this point on. And this is actually how I work live. I like to set up everything to -18 dB so that I know I'm in a good starting point. I know exactly where I am, and then if anything goes drastically wrong through a show or something, either jumps up in level or drops down in level, you can just look at the metering and you can tell straight away that there's an issue, because you know everything should be metering at -18. In the studio, however, we can go a step further. And we could, listening to this mix, we can hear that it's still quite organ heavy. The bass and the guitar are a bit more even, and the kick and snare are still a bit weak. And the reason for this is to do with the average level of each sound. The organ stays pretty much consistent from the moment the note is hit to the moment the note stops playing. It wavers a bit, but it stays close to the peak, so it's got a high average. The kick drum hits its peak very early and then drops away, and the same with the snare. And so it actually drops low very quickly, so the average is actually a lot lower. So what we can do is bring up the average by bringing up the peak. And we can find a sort of pleasant level. You can do this by ear as much as looking at the meters, and you can find an even level which can give you an even better starting point to mixing. So what I'm actually going to do is try bringing the kick and snare up to -12 and see how that sits in the mix. You don't really want to go much above -12, couple of reasons being you start running into headroom issues where you're getting closer to this clipping point. Not that you're running into a problem right away, but when you stop dropping in EQs and boosting EQ especially, that's going to eat more of this headroom up, and you can end up running into clipping problems quite quickly. The other reason I try and keep between -18 and -12 is that most of your outboard equipment and your plugins in your DAW are calibrated to work in between that sort of area. So too low, your plugins are not going to be working quite as efficiently as they should do, and too high, and they're more likely to clip, or at least not be in their optimal range of use. So it's a good rule of thumb to sit between -18 and -12 as much as possible. So let's just bring the kick and snare up and then match everything else around and see how it goes. Kicks, good. So the snare now. The snare sounding pretty good. Let's move to the bass. Now the bass is sounding slightly weak, so let's bring that up a little. Sounding pretty good. Let's check the guitar. I think the guitar can come up a tad. And I think we'll leave the organ where it is. Have a check of the mix. Okay, so you can see that without any EQ, any compression, any effects, any fader riding, just by balancing out gains at the start, we're already in a much better position to start properly mixing the song, and to get a good idea of what the vibe of the tune is. If you've never heard it before you start mixing, you want to know what the feel of the song is and how you wish to approach mixing it. So this helps you get to a great starting point. Anyway, that's all for this video, so I hope it's helpful. If it is, then please subscribe, hit the like button, feel free to leave comments and questions. Check out my website at adventuresinaudio.co.uk, and I'm on Twitter at AIA Vibes, and I'm on Facebook at AIA Vibes, and I will see you on the next video.